the one-year anniversary of Russia's special military operation in Ukraine approaches, the Russian President Vladimir Putin has said Russia would defeat Ukraine in the grip of a new incarnation of Nazism. Meanwhile, the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky continues to ask for handouts, this time for F-16 jets, which the U.S. and its allies like Germany have rejected for now. In this edition of the Spotlight, we will look at this war and see how close or how far the warring sides are when it comes to peace. First, let me introduce our guest for this edition of the Spotlight. Bosnitch, journalist, activist, and political analyst, joins us from Belgrade. Also joining us, Sara Flounders from the International Action Center, who joins us from New York. Welcome to you both. John Bosnitch, first over to you. As of today, 2nd of February, this is what the Russian President Vladimir Putin has said. He said at these looming deliveries of these Western-made tanks to Ukraine. Apparently, they have not been done yet, and issued a warning that Moscow's response to the threat will span far beyond armored vehicles. Quote, those seeking to defeat Russia on the battlefield apparently do not realize that a modern war with Russia would be entirely different for them. We're not sending our tanks to their borders, yet we have something to respond with, and it would not be limited to armor use only. Everyone must realize that. I don't know, that sounds pretty frightening, isn't it?
Well, the situation here is that as in Vietnam, the United States is operating what's called mission creep. They slowly creep into a territory, they destabilize the government, they create a crisis in the country, they create a civil war, and then they back one side, and then they slowly respond to requests from that side for military support. But that side is just a marionette regime run directly from Washington. So what we're seeing here in Ukraine is actually the Americans putting their man and their team in power in Kiev, and then making it look like Kiev is seeking support. All of this is a charade, and it's a charade directed directly against Russia. It has nothing to do with Ukraine except to use it as a stepping stone to destroy Russia. That's the basic scenario that we're living in now.
Sir Flounders, what do you make of what the Russian president had said, that we have something to respond with and it would not be limited to armor use only? Everyone must realize that. Do you think he's talking about like hypersonic missiles, or are we looking at the nuclear word here?
Well, I'm certainly not a weapons expert, so I don't know what next weapon they're discussing. But once more and more weapons are pumped in from the West of a higher and higher destructive capacity, that will be matched from Russia. That's a fact. And Russia has stated this again and again. So new rounds of tanks, which are not just the vehicle itself. With all of these tanks come a vast mechanized array of repair and support and fueling and really hundreds and a great deal of other equipment that goes with it, the ammunition for it, the fuel for it, and so on. So, and it's a whole range of different tanks, really a hodgepodge assortment. But it's one more way of escalating the war. And step by step, that is what has been happening as Ukrainian forces have suffered one defeat after another. Now, this is a war that was brought on by the U.S. and NATO. The U.S. and NATO wants this war. They expected that this war would, and the sanctions with it, would break, would consume Russia. And that is not what's happened at all. So in their frustration, they're going deeper in. And each step is more dangerous because they want a long war. And that is exactly the greatest danger that we're facing. Their only course forward is to try to bog Russia down in a war that consumes Russia, but in effect it is consuming the US and the European Union, who are paying a very heavy price for this aggression.
We're going to get to that point, Sara Flounders, maybe a little bit later, for sure a little bit later. But I need to find out from you, John Bosnitch, again, what in this case Russia has said, this case being the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. Looking at his statement, Russia um, outlines response if Ukraine gets long-range weapons. Now he's talking about longer-range weapons, and he says the greater Kiev's capabilities become, the further its troops will be pushed back. There are a couple questions here. First of all, why hasn't Russia done that already? Why hasn't Russia pushed back the Ukrainian troops? Do you think Russia is bluffing? It seems like this war is going increasing in intensity in phases, but it seems like Ukraine makes the move, then Russia has to respond. Ukraine makes the move, Russia responds. Why doesn't Russia just respond, go for what it needs to go after, and then take it from there?
Well, first of all, you have to start from the viewpoint of the Russian people, is that the Ukrainian people are a brother nation, if not actually just displaced ethnic Russians. So the Russian view is that any conflict in Ukraine is a battle between brothers, and Russia wants to minimize the fighting against brothers who've been misled and who have been propagandized by A, the Vatican, B, America, C, England, and not necessarily in that order. There's also the leftovers of the influence of Adolf Hitler, who created an SS division in Ukraine in World War II and resulted in the flight to the West of those former Nazis who are strongly supporting the position of the Ukrainian nationalists of Western Ukraine, who actually are in territory that did not belong to Ukraine in the past. It belonged to Poland and to other countries. So the complexity of this situation is hard to describe in English, especially for English viewers and listeners who have no information about this subject whatsoever, because it's not taught in Western schools and it's avoided in public discourse, because if the public knew what had happened in Ukraine, they would not be supporting another neo-Nazi inspired war in Ukraine. The threat by Russia to respond in kind to every weapon the West brings into the theater is a message to the Ukrainian people that they do not want to do so, and that it will only happen if the West provokes it. The statement by Russia that they need to push the Ukrainian forces back from Russian territory is a simple matter of logistics. They cannot allow long-range weapons to hit the citizens inside Russia, and therefore, whatever the range of those weapons is, that has to be the final frontline position of Ukraine, so that they cannot shoot inside Russia. Russia has been taking this very peacefully, as far as can be said, and Russia did not intervene during 8 years of literally genocidal warfare against ethnic Russians inside Ukraine. Many people have criticized President Putin, but I would support him insofar as I think he is looking forward to a post-war situation in which Ukraine and Russia are close allies once again.
Sir Flounders, you talked about how U.S. and EU are, and I forget exactly what you said, but they're going into this war and they're getting more engulfed into this war. My question to you is, do you think that the U.S. is dictating the terms of this war with, I guess, with Zelensky in terms of how far and how long it should go on for? Because the Russian foreign minister, and this is not a new accusation, it came out months and months ago, where he said that the U.S. is blocking Ukraine from conducting peace talks, along with the EU, of which we know, in particular, it was the former Prime Minister of the UK, Boris Johnson, during a trip to Ukraine, prevented Zelensky from going ahead with talks with Russia that was scheduled. So what is the purpose there of them trying to prevent peace talks from happening between the two?
Well, first of all, Zelensky is a real creation of the U.S. and is in office because of a staged coup in 2014 and the elections completely staged that took place after that, and the outlawing of opposition parties and forces. So to assume that anything Zelensky says is an independent force, it's not at all. He is simply the window dressing, the Ukrainian face on a U.S.-NATO war. Does the U.S. want a long-term war in Ukraine? Yes, they do. And are they willing to fight to the last Ukrainian, make Ukraine simply a proxy force? They've certainly done that before in other countries and in other struggles. So this would not by any means be the first time. Now, it's been the same thing with any mention of peace talks. Ukraine was part of arriving at an agreement with Russia. It was ruled out. It was really the U.S. and Britain who said, no way. Boris Johnson personally went to Kiev to say, nope. So there's an order to fight and to continue to fight and to continue to provide arms and trainers. There are just thousands of NATO and private contractors and a whole assortment of foreign forces in Ukraine today who are their own army and continue this war, along with the funded Nazi forces in Ukraine. So the idea that the Ukrainian people have called for this, voted for this, they didn't. Zelensky first masked himself as a peace candidate. Of course, he wasn't at all. So we really have to see what are U.S. NATO interests in this war, not what is Ukraine's interest, because if Ukraine were following the interests of the Ukrainian people, of people in Ukraine, Russian and Ukrainian, of course they would be for ending the war this minute. But they really have no say. They really don't. And that needs to be, who's pulling the strings on this? I very much agree with John Bosnitch.
And even I think even more important than that, if you agree, John Bosnitch, is the point that Sara Flounders raises there. I mean, Zelensky speaking on behalf of the Ukrainian people in terms of prolonging the war. I mean, look, we're looking at high-profile 9 dismissals that were just recently executed because of corruption. You're looking at these 9 members that went on vacation to Spain or France and took bribes during the war. So, and then Zelensky, of course, ramping up anti-corruption drive. But there's 15 Ukrainian officials as a whole. Who knows how much money and who knows, well, the numbers are cited there, but who knows how many officials are actually part of this? And you mean to tell me that these are the ones that are representing Ukraine to prolong the war, for them to continue to die? I mean, that's very, I don't want to sound like a 2-year-old, but that's very mean. To have these people who are involved in corruption and taking vacations to be involved in the decision making. Now they've been fired. They've said no, it's not true. But we need to. Some of them have been actually resigned because they said we need to gain the public trust.
First of all, I agree with and support every word that Sara Flounders has told you here today. She's right on the mark. Furthermore, the operation in Ukraine has at least 3 aspects. One, a bribery-based operation in which they pay off puppets like Zelensky, and I believe that the entire scenario of Zelensky was planned probably as much as 15 or 20 years ago. They just had to find the proper actor, and Zelensky's television program in which he became the president of Ukraine was surely scripted in a CIA-directed operation to create the persona of Zelensky before he even existed as a real president. These are what are called deep fake operations that the CIA does 10 and 20 years in advance, so that when the opportunity arises, they have the candidate already ready to take power, and they simply drop him into the chair. That's what's happened with Zelensky. Zelensky naturally would be surrounded by people who are also aware of how this has been done. They're also aware of how much, in terms of millions of dollars, Zelensky has ferreted away, and which were revealed in the Pandora Papers in offshore accounts, and they wanted their cut. So they took their cut. And when it looks like the boat may be sinking, the first people off the boat are always the rats, as we know, and the rats have run. Now Zelensky, who is too high profile to be able to run and live, is stuck in the presidential chair trying to fight it out till the end. The end is not a victory. There is zero chance that Ukraine can win this war, because if Ukraine were allowed, and it could only be by being allowed to win by Russia, if they were allowed to win, that would be the end of Russia. Russia would be under nuclear a range of close, high-speed missiles and would have no chance of defending itself. So the war cannot be won by Ukraine. That's point number one. Point number two, the bribed officials have run away and only Zelensky remains. And point number three is a question of whether or not the people of Ukraine are going to realize this, overthrow Ukraine's current puppet regime, which is run by Washington, for Washington, and for the military industrial complex of the United States. Because the longer the war runs, the more new weapons need to be donated and need to be built. And when we build new weapons, we're talking tens of billions of dollars in the pockets of the military industrial complex, who pulls the strings not only in Kiev, but in Washington too.
Okay, some of these points have been discussed already, but since we have both of you here, obviously your opinion is very important to us. And Sara Flounders, one of the points raised there by John Bosnitch is about military equipment, military ammunition, of which there are reports that overall point to the fact that NATO countries and the U.S. itself, they're running low. And once some of these certain military ammunitions run out of stock, it will take months for them to be replaced. And this is probably the question that I want to ask you, is the worst case scenario happening for the U.S. and NATO as a whole, is if they run out of ammunition. I mean, you can't just tell Russia, excuse me, wait until we produce more ammunition and we'll continue the fight. It's not going to work that way. So isn't that one thing that should be a huge worry for the U.S., not to mention for Ukraine, obviously, and NATO? And the bigger question to you after that, if you can forge it into one, is the U.S. and NATO really can't afford to lose this war, can they? Because in essence, if they lose to Russia, then they will take a huge hit. Tell us the ramifications of that.
All right, well, first of all, on the weapons, what's in U.S. interests is selling, dispensing, disposing of their weapons. Huge profits in the weapons, in the military industry. And where it goes in Ukraine, frankly, they don't care. More than a third of these weapons and the ammunition goes missing, unaccounted for, resold, the dark web. Where does it go? They don't care. And the fact that they're not even looking shows how much is it a weapon of war, or is it just a way of keeping going? And all of the NATO countries that are forced to ante up and ship weapons, they know that it's very costly. They'll have to purchase more U.S. weapons because they're members of NATO, so they have obligations on what kind of weapons and what amounts they have to keep. So all of this becomes profitable business for the U.S. and very costly for the other NATO members. Now, just in short, what was the second?
Ramifications for the U.S. and for NATO, and in turn, obviously, Ukraine, if they lose this war,
Okay.
whatever that scenario is going to look like, what the ramifications that would have.
President Putin speaking, comparing, talking about the importance of the Battle of Stalingrad. Let's look at what that was, why it was so important. It was really the turning point, and it was huge losses in terms of the German military command, but it stopped the German advance into the Soviet Union at great cost. But the battle going on right now in Ukraine is really stopping NATO's advance into Russia. It's a key struggle that's happening. And Russia will win because they know their very survival, their existence is dependent on it. This is an existential fight for them, their very existence. And NATO wants to dismember Russia, divide it up. They already have the maps, the charts. They want to do, and worse, what they did in the 1990s to the Soviet Union. the whole world paid a terrible price for that. And of course, the people of the former Soviet Union. So that's what they want to do again. They want to finish the job, and they're not going to succeed. It is why there is such a national effort in Russia to match every weapon, and why the Ukrainian forces, no matter how many are pumped in and how many other contractors are sent, are not any match for it. And we've seen it really in the past year, the way every battle has unfolded.
Just a few days ago, let's see, today is Thursday, a week ago, I'm sorry. This is what the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said, John Bosnitch, warning Russia was building up its troops to take revenge on the West. This being a year into Moscow's special military operation, which he didn't call that. He called it an invasion. What do you think we can expect from Russia as an anniversary gift to not only his troops, but a message to Ukraine and the West? Obviously NATO and the US part of that.
Well, I expect to see a show of force of the new Russian weapons, which delayed effectively the development of modern, superior Russian weapons, delayed Russia's response. The genocidal attack on ethnic Russians in Ukraine started 8 years before President Putin and the Russian army finally responded by directly entering the territory of Donbass. What we should see on the anniversary, if President Putin uses the anniversary to make a statement in military terms, is a devastating bombardment, a devastating advance of new weapons, the crossing of armies across new borders, and so on. And I think that there's something that has to be said here that I haven't said before, and perhaps it needs to be said pretty clearly, that the real target of all of these money-making schemes in the West is the American citizen, the American taxpayer, because all the money and the citizens of the EU colonies of NATO, military colonies, because these people have been propagandized to believe that Russia is attacking them.
Okay.
And they have to defend themselves, which is not the truth. It is the biggest money steal in Western history ever.
I wish we had more time to expand on that, but we're fresh out of time. John Bosnitch, thank you. Journalist, activist, and political analyst. Sara Flounders, thank you, from the International Action Center from New York. Thank you to you both. With that, we come to an end for this edition of The Spotlight from Mikava Tabwe and the team. Just goodbye.